Vikas.
Morning.
Morning all. Morning everyone that has joined us promptly at 9 a.m. Very impressive. We'll have a few more joining us as the kettles boil and the teas are organised, I'm sure. So welcome everyone to the latest K. Johnson G seminar, online seminar, as they've been for a while, needless to say, which is all part of K. Johnson G helping you and your clients build a better business. This morning we're delighted to welcome Vikas Shah to our seminar, and I'll be chatting to Vikas about his or prompted by, maybe not about, prompted by this wonderful, I don't know if you can see it on my screen, this wonderful new book, Thought Economics. Vikas will explain more, but I think you started almost by accident a series of interviews with interesting people, and after a number of years decided it was worth pulling some threads together in this book. The book, interestingly, is not just about business. One of the reasons it's a good read as far as I'm concerned is it covers topics like identity, culture, discrimination, conflict, and democracy. So it's covering some ground, Vikas, it has to be said. It also, however, covers leadership and entrepreneurship. And those are the two topics that we'll focus on today. We'll take no more than an hour, as that's most people's attention span on a video call, I would suggest. There's a Q&A function for everyone there's a chat function, but there's also a Q&A function, which is probably better, which should be at the bottom of your screen, depending on your screen format. Just fire any questions or thoughts in there, and we'll do our best to pick those up, and Vikas can respond. So, Vikas, is it worth you now correcting where I've gone wrong as regards where this has all come from?
Yeah, so, well, first of all, thanks for the invitation to come on today. You know, I know we've sort of brushed collaborations on various things, and it's always fun to work with you. So, so Thought Economics is a bit of an odd story, because my background isn't journalism. I'm not a writer. I like many of the people on the call today, my background's been in the world of business. You know, I've started out in technology and now own a few different companies in textiles and investment and a small film production company. And so where this hobby that went rogue came from was back in 2006, 2007. The whole media landscape was changing, and I get why, because the business model that you needed to make a newspaper or a magazine work shifted from being kind of in-depth, long-form content to being more, sound bites, social content, viral content, the kind of headline grabs that we see now. And and that's all well and good, but for me as a kind of consumer of media, I used to really enjoy the kind of long form interviews and the kind of more journal style content. So I just thought one day, well, I've been lucky enough to meet lots of interesting people over the years. By that point, I'd sort of exited the technology business that I had. And I thought, well, maybe just some of them want to speak to me. And there was nobody particularly famous or nobody, at that level. And I just started doing these interviews on a very standard blog on blogger.com. But what I didn't realize is that lots of other people also kind of were craving that content. So the traffic started to build. And then I got a bit, curious as well. There's a big wide world out there. Who else can I get to? And the first sort of household name person that I spoke to was Jimmy Wales, who founded Wikipedia. And, he gave me a chance, and I had a good hour-long conversation with him about the story of Wikipedia and how collaborative media was changing the world. And that just got me hooked. And that's when I sort of realized that this was something which I just found really interesting. There was never a plan with it. I just really enjoyed doing it and kept
I,
doing it.
accidental writer is the.
Yeah.
Do you think? Do you think, just as a little bit off topic, do you think there is an issue with people's attention span on long versus short media items? You know,
Yeah.
the classic being social media, little soundbite type things that we all, sorry, most of us consume,
Yeah.
or rapid, in a rabid manner. Some of us. Do you think there's an issue with attention span then as
This,
regards longer pieces?
yeah, I mean, there's a massive issue, and I think that the issue that I see is twofold. So I've interviewed several people about this who are kind of, ex-technologists who are sort of now whistleblowers on the fact that the platforms that we use are far cleverer than we are, and so they can manipulate us. And so whatever makes us angry, whatever makes us, feel divided or feel passionate about something, that's what keeps us engaged, and they're designed to feed us more of that. So it's a bit like, you buy the phone which connects the drip, and then all these technologies are basically there to keep drugging you. That's what they do. So there's one aspect of it, which is that we as a society are being actively manipulated to stay engaged with these platforms. The second part of it is, it's very unlikely that you'll ever understand a topic unless you are prepared to give the time, energy, and focus to reading deeply about it. So it's very easy for someone to sit there and go, oh, refugees shouldn't be allowed in. It kind of intuitively makes sense as a headline. But then the minute you read into it and you realize that actually countries have obligations under human rights conventions, that refugees are escaping conflict and torture and all these things, the deeper you read into a topic, the more of a rounded understanding you get. And so there's two worries I have. Firstly, which is a reluctance for people to actually spend the time actually getting to know a subject, meaning that you read the bits that you do and don't agree with, because that's how you form an opinion. And secondly, the fact that actually the technology platforms that we use to consume our media are basically designed to manipulate us out of the box, and they do it very well.
Yeah, I think someone described it to me recently as being there being a lack of nuance in many sort of discussions and debates. So it has to be black or white or binary or whatever.
Nuance doesn't get clicks.
Yeah, exactly.
Like for example, if you looked at three headlines, one headline says, if we stick with the refugee example, if one headline said refugees are stealing all our jobs, click. One headline says, people are denying refugees their human rights, click. But if the article in the middle was like, actually, on balance, the refugee crisis doesn't cause us that many problems in terms of admissions, and it's actually our obligation to take them in, swipe. It's the reality is actually nowhere near as exciting as either end of the polarization spectrum.
Yeah, it's sound bites and sun newspaper type headlines, isn't it? So moving us on though, because we should talk about a couple of key topics today of leadership and entrepreneurship. So looking at the thinking of your own experiences, obviously, Vikas, and the people that you've managed to interview, on the topic of leadership, you've interviewed people in the military, space travel, or space, would it be travel? Space
exploration.
Space exploration, thank you, that's the word. Business, obviously, academia, and even sport. Been in the news lately as regards the interaction between business and sport, of course, and football. But as regards, the point I'm making as regards the topic of leadership initially would be that you've not just spoken to business people, as relevant as they are. It's a broad spectrum, if you like, that you've covered. And so, the obvious first question as regards leadership is, what is it? What does it mean? What do people, what do various people from various backgrounds think it actually is?
Yeah. So it's kind of interesting because I feel that the business community has almost claimed this word leadership. So typically, in the kind of parlance, when someone goes, oh, leader, you think Musk or Bezos. And it's kind of because I think the community's kind of claimed it, maybe a bit wrongly, because actually when we think about leadership, whether we look at the military or sports or community or whatever it is, our world is full of people who are leaders in their own right. And that's where, when I was exploring leadership, my view was, okay, well, who are the people that are leading in the most extreme environments? Who are the people that are leading people to do, difficult, dangerous things? So that's where I thought, okay, well, let's speak to people in the military, let's speak to people in space exploration, and then let's contrast those views with business, with sports and other areas. And fundamentally, what really came through was actually, for people to become effective leaders, irrespective of the field, it's about bringing your group, so the group of your tribe, let's say, along with you to achieve a specific mission, right? That mission could be anything. The mission could be building, the next big business. The mission could be executing a particular challenge if you're in the military, but it has to be mission driven. And that individual or that group of individuals who are leading have to have a very high level of emotional intelligence. That's almost a prerequisite to be, in inverted commas, a great leader, is you have to have the emotional intelligence to understand, how am I going to bring this gaggle of people with me to execute this mission, which I know is important. And I think this is where, actually, if we learn how the most extreme leaders do it, so, when I say extreme, I'm thinking, extreme environments rather than extreme individuals, of course. But if we learn how people are able to lead in extreme environments, I think we can all distill that into our slightly more mundane lives in business. And that's where I think the military in particular is a very interesting area where we can all take leadership learnings.
Is it safe to say, do you think, Vikas, that because the military guys in your book that you've covered in your book are fascinating? These are people that have obviously dealt with life or death situations, as important as businesses are, and obviously crucial to society and well-being. In terms of a sort of a moment in time, these are guys that have dealt with extreme situations. Is it not easier though for them to understand leadership, but on the other hand, understand it in quite a almost autocratic, authoritarian way, which doesn't necessarily fit with business?
It's interesting because the extreme, the life and death bit of military life is actually a relatively small part of your overall time. It's a bit like, it might be, if we compressed our working year, it might be that there was a particular day where it's kind of life and death. But a lot of it is actually figuring out who are the best people in your team to do particular tasks, forming effective teams, giving them autonomy, giving those teams the ability to fail safely, giving those teams the ability to, figure out how to modify a mission to achieve a goal. So there's lots of things there that actually I think are very relevant to business, for the simple reason that nowadays, whether you're in, whether it's a small business and you're just starting out, or whether you're a larger business, you have to be more agile. You have to be able to move faster. You have to have teams that can shift and change their direction autonomously without you needing to give them specific commands. Because, again, to use a military analogy, let's say that General Stephen Lindsay is leading his troops into a particular mission. You're going to have a few hundred people, maybe more, who are there to execute a specific mission. You have to trust that they know what the goal is and they will autonomously shift and adapt to help the whole group succeed, right? And they also need to know what to do when things go wrong. So those are the kind of broad learnings, which I think are the most appropriate ones that we can take away, rather than, as you said, those what happens in those life or death moments, because that's not necessarily about leadership. That's more about kind of emotional and physical resilience to get you through that moment. But the thing that I took away from it is, whilst the military provide an interesting analog to business and an interesting learning environment to business, there was definitely a lot of value in speaking to people who have scaled big companies, so like Jack Welch and Tony Hsieh from Zappos and people like that, because especially in the technology field, that they're learning in this very alien way, because some of these businesses, like when I spoke to Stuart Butterfield from Slack, that still is the fastest growing technology company in the history of tech, right? In terms of how many people they onboarded. The only, Amazon arguably recruited more people in a single year. So Amazon last year recruited over 500,000 people globally, but a lot of those jobs were in logistics and support, whereas Slack were recruiting tens of thousands of people across their entire vertical as the company grew. And for him, what I learned from Stuart really was about the fact that as a CEO, you have to somewhat distance yourself from that operational capacity of a business. You have to be able to imbue the business with a culture that means that the business broadly knows what the right thing to do is in any situation. It shouldn't be incumbent on leaders to need to make those decisions, because if the leaders always have to make that decision, the company can't grow. And I actually went to visit. So back in the before times when we used to travel, I did try and visit as many of these interviewees as I can. And so when I went to Slack headquarters in San Francisco, you really saw that. You really saw the fact that the culture was so well embedded in that organization that in a broad sense, people knew what was the right way to approach something against that company culture. Netflix is very similar. Pixar is very similar as well. And so is Microsoft, actually.
Yeah, because Tony C, if that's how you pronounce his surname, he has he talks in your interview about actually avoiding the word leadership.
Yeah.
He literally says he doesn't effectively doesn't really like it, doesn't use it. Because he sees, I think, as I remember it, he sees leadership more about how you facilitate things and building the architecture that allows a particular way of working and development of the business in this case.
It is strange, because when I started out on this journey, and until that time, I obviously hadn't met many of the the Bransons and the Dysons and these billionaires of the world. They weren't kind of part of my life, apart from just being people that
they're not on your coffee network.
Well, exactly. So I had this kind of preconceived notion of what it meant. Like, surely these were all massive egos who love to be in the helm. And one of the things that I found quite counterintuitive was exactly this, which is most of these individuals, they didn't necessarily see themselves as leaders. They didn't necessarily like the term leader or entrepreneur or boss. What they saw was the fact that they were very good at putting the right people in the right jobs and then conducting that orchestra to do what needed to be done. And with only a couple of exceptions where actually the ego definitely was there, most of them were very values driven, very emotionally intelligent, very resilient. And it's quite the refreshing antithesis to what we see on shows like The Apprentice and things like this, where the general viewer seems to think that to be successful as a business person, you've got to be this kind of tough guy. And that genuinely has not been my experience over the last decade, speaking to hundreds of the most successful business people on the planet.
And does the linking back to the media again, and it can I'm sure be very, very exaggerated, but is there an issue there as regards how things are perceived, how leadership is perceived?
Sure. So there's definitely, look, but tough people, tough guys make good TV, right? Like, it's much better TV for someone to go, "You're fired," than it is for someone to go, "I see where you made a mistake. Let's dig in and figure out why that happened and come up with a plan." Less good TV, right? So I don't think the media necessarily has a problem, but I think it's important to showcase the fact that this is theatre, right? Something like The Apprentice is basically just entertainment.
Yeah,
it's not. And you've worked with far more business people than I have, and so you'll know yourself that that's just not what people are like. And I think the other bit, which I think is more worrying for me, is what I call entrepreneur influencer culture. And there are so many people who actually aren't entrepreneurs, who basically have had like they've had some success or whatever, and they suddenly blow up as influencers because they can tweet platitudes or Instagram inspirational quotes and write books about lots of inspirational things and encourage people to always be on the hustle and always be on the grind. And if you're not working 22 hours a day, you're not successful. And the thing that I find really worrying is, I teach at a couple of business schools and I work with lots of startups, and a lot of younger people coming through genuinely believe that stuff. And that really worries me, because that, I think, is more toxic than something like The Apprentice, which is basically entertainment.
Yeah, agreed. And it as regards the the characteristics and the drivers of leadership, the sort of topics, and you've touched on a few already, obviously, as because all of this interlinks. But the characteristics and drivers of leadership, what would you say were the key ones that have come out from the various interviews, Vikas?
So it's always been, I know I used the phrase before, but it's always been quite mission driven. So whilst, for many people, wealth is an inevitable outcome of that mission being successful, the mission is what they were there for, right? As in, it might be that they just saw a better way of doing something, that they wanted to change something, that they had a passion for something. And that mission was what drove them to actually keep going. That was it. I very rarely, even outside the thought economics journey, I've very rarely met any entrepreneurs who've made bags of money who genuinely were initially motivated by that. They usually had an idea of saying, well, maybe there's a better way of doing this. And it just so happened that timing and luck and all these things convened to make that very successful. And I think, again, this is a myth that's important to break, because the vast majority, the 99.99% of entrepreneurs never make that kind of big money. Most business people you'll meet make a living. But actually, if you put most business people in a bucket against, lawyers or finance folk or whatever, the professional services people in that bucket are making far more money. It's just that those entrepreneurs have a different career path. So these are kind of assumptions which we sort of, as business people, know aren't true. But I think the general perception still is that there is this motivation purely by money or purely by greed or things like that. And again, that was really apparent. Richard Branson, who I think is probably Richard Branson and Dyson are the two big UK figures that I spoke to. And, for both of them, even though they've both achieved, fabulous wealth, there was a real curiosity. James Dyson is still a massive engineering geek who loves building things and making things work. And, he still goes through thousands of prototypes of different machines because he just loves it. And yes, he's made lots of money, but he loves it. Richard Branson loves ideas and loves the startup phase and loves to bring things to life. And that's genuine. And you can see it when you're speaking to them, that's when they animate. That's when they light up. That's when they, you can see they're really passionate about it. So I think the lesson there is you need to be feeling like that about the business if you're kind of on the right path, because otherwise there is no way you'll be able to deal with the challenges that the business world brings if you haven't got that mission driven attitude.
Yeah. Do you think there's a difference in any way in terms of the importance of the money? The money versus the ideas and the excitement, if I can just differentiate those two, although they obviously connect very strongly. But do you think there's a difference because of leaders or entrepreneurs' background? In other words, if they're coming from a relatively wealthy background, a comfortable, let's say, background, they're not as bothered about money because they don't need to be. If someone's coming from a relatively poorer background, is money more of a driver because actually at the beginning it needed to be, or is that just far too simplistic a view?
Do you know, it has been interesting where there's been certain people that I've spoken to where actually there has definitely been that notion of I never want to go back there. But it's more, And I'm going to use the word aesthetic, but it's not the right word. I just can't think of what the right word would be. But it's not that they don't want to go back there in terms of just being in poverty, let's say. It's more everything else that goes with it. It's security. So it's more that they don't want to feel insecure in life. And that's often a driver to, create financial security around them. But financial security, in terms of the grander entrepreneurship journey, financial security is let's say stage one, but then it's okay. Like for most of us mere mortals, if we had a few million in the bank, we'd be plenty financially secure, right? So let's say someone like yourself, Stephen, who maybe has 10 million in the bank, right? So let's say
that was a few years ago, before that bad investment, Vikas.
so exactly. So let's say that somebody has that in the bank and they're now very financially secure. Most of the people I've spoken to, they went way past financial security and they may now have a couple of billion in the bank. So it's a driver up to a point. But then if that is your driver, once you reach that point, you're going to poop out. You'll be like, cool, I'm done now. Right. And that's the bit that really fascinates me, is kind of, if that is the driver, there is a point at which you are now I've forgotten who it was I'd spoken to. It was actually one of the lesser known entrepreneurs from the Nordics who's made billions in pharmaceuticals. And he said, if he makes another 100 million, it makes no difference. There's no incremental change to his life. If he makes a billion more, never mind 100 million. So the motivation has to be different. And that's the bit which I found really fascinating is, maybe there is that initial spark of, I need to get away from my circumstances. But once you've got there, then what then keeps you going on the 99% more of the journey that you're going on?
Yeah. No, it's interesting, because I think it was Stu Friedman who you interviewed, who was saying, made an interesting point, I thought, which was that as regards leadership, that it wasn't about your position in an organization. It was about the qualities you have and what you do, rather than where you are in any sort of hierarchical type structure. And it was interesting to me because you do find people who are actually good leaders, and are not in an obvious position of power, if you like, in an organization, but they're just good leaders. They just do that well in their particular orbit. And you also find people, of course, who are in positions of apparent power and up the hierarchy, as it were, who just aren't.
Yeah, it's interesting because some of this also, whilst you have to excuse the slight philosophical change of tone, but some of it also comes down to what matters economically and philosophically to us at a time. It's not that long ago where industry was the engine, right? We think of ourselves as being these big digital creatures, but it was not that long ago where the main engine of production in our economy was industry. Not those big dusty mills, but cars and boats and genuinely making things. And in the industrial economy, hierarchies matter because the people are there to service the machines, and the machines are doing the work to produce the car or the boat or whatever it might be. The big shift has been the fact that in a service-driven and information economy, the machine is now the people. And so there's a whole different approach. So instead of it being a kind of hierarchy, it's become a bit more nebulous. And there's been a requirement for more people to become leaders in different parts of an organization to deliver, what is often a nebulous output, like a successful consulting contract, or it might be a particular other project. Even in the modern industrial economy, leadership is different because, for example, with our textiles business, if we go to one of our factories, it's like a PC world or something. There's lots and lots of very complex machines and lots of smart people operating the complex machines. And actually, because production lines now are so just in time, the necessity for leadership is far higher. So if we get, let's say, a break on a particular machine, a team has to autonomously form to resolve that, to resolve the supply chain issues and make sure there's no disruption, right? That's a very different approach to you managing your business as it was during the industrial era, where you put your cap on and take your pipe down, look at the machine and go, aye, we'll need a new one of them. You know, it's a very, very different approach. But what we cannot kid ourselves that was history. You know, the flat cap and the pipe going down to the machine was genuinely not that long ago. So as a society, we are still very much figuring out what is the new optimal shape of a business for an economy, which is either what I would call advanced industrial, or indeed purely based on the information or service economy.
Yeah, absolutely. And moving, I mean, obviously, as we talk about leadership, we rightly talk about entrepreneurship as part of it. So
Yeah.
we're covering both together rather than separately to a large extent, as it should be. But specifically on entrepreneurship, then, rather than leadership, you know, same question to the extent that it's not been covered before, Vikas. You know, what entrepreneurship? What is it? What does it mean? You know, it's one of those, as you've covered earlier. You know, there is that extreme entertainment-based view of what it means, a la, you know, The Apprentice or whatever it would be on the TV. But you know, cutting through that sort of nonsense, it's you know, what from the when in talking about entrepreneurship, I think the thing I should say actually before sort of focusing on it is, in that area, when you cover that topic, I'm sorry, in your book, you are specifically really focusing on business people and business entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
You know, unlike, say, leadership, where there's a broader sort of spectrum, naturally enough. So as you've spoken to that plethora of business people, you know, how would you sort of, what would the key messages be as regards what it actually means?
So it was interesting. So I'd run my first business for quite some time before somebody told me I was an entrepreneur, and I was like, didn't know that was a word, to be honest. And it's funny because I don't know if there really is a clear definition. One thing which I took away was the fact that there was the act of founding. There was the act of being able to found a business, and you know, that was one step. But then actually, to get a business to grow and succeed, there was a set of skills you need, and that set of skills could broadly be put into the kind of category of entrepreneurship, right? So that set of skills might include the ability to think, to innovate, right? The ability to raise money, to scale, to build agile teams, to recruit, to be able to lead. You know, we've talked about that, to be able to think about marketing differently. So there's this whole suite of skills which you might refer to as the craft of entrepreneurship, as separate to being a founder. And I think in terms of how we think about business, it is probably very useful for us to perhaps make that distinction, because there are plenty of corporate leaders like Sundar Pichai and others who are clearly entrepreneurs, but we wouldn't think of them as entrepreneurs because, well, they weren't the founder. You know, Tim Cook, I would class as an entrepreneur, but he wasn't the founder. So I think it's healthier for us to think of people who are entrepreneurs as people who are very good at this craft. And that craft is then applied in a corporate setting, in a research setting, or in a founder-led business. And that's something which I do think we need to have that conversation about. The other thing was, I think, the mental skills were really critical. And it's something which came out a lot during these conversations. So, you know, a lot of the people who built these, you know, businesses at scale were very attuned to their own mental health. So we're talking there about the fact that they were, you know, very resilient in their approach to stress management. They were very careful to look after their physical health. to get enough sleep, to eat right, all those kind of good things. They'd also taken a lot of time to understand how people think, because you've got to be able to, make good intuitive decisions. So that, I think, is also a real keystone in that craft of being an entrepreneur.
And the points that jumped out to me when I was reading that section of the book as regards, what does entrepreneurship mean? Were things like taking risks, measured risks, I'm sure, but taking risks, pushing boundaries, not being afraid to fail.
Yeah.
And we'll come back to failure and talk about it specifically later, actually, because it's an interesting topic in itself. But one of the really interesting descriptions for me was that it was something about the sort of the interaction of the intersection, it was between passion and ability. So you need the passion, you need to have the drive, but you need certain skills and abilities. And it was described, and I can't remember who it was now, the intersection of those, which I thought was quite an interesting way of describing it.
It's true, because there's lots of people who you meet who've got a great idea which never make it, right? But there's lots of people who have a very mediocre idea who make it very well. And some of it may not seem obvious, but it is. When I started my first business, I had to hammer the phones and try and win some business, right? And that's soul destroying, because you could spend 5 days hammering the phones and get constant rejections and constantly fobbed off, right? If you do not have the mental resilience to get through that, doesn't matter, you're not going to succeed, right? And that's where the intersection lies. I have unfortunately met lots of entrepreneurs who've had brilliant ideas, but they haven't got that bit, or they've not been able to learn that bit. And it is learnable, it's not an inherent. So I think the intersection is really key, but that's where, entrepreneurship education is kind of important. And right now, when you're going into schools and universities, I guess, right, somewhat rightly, entrepreneurship education is plunked in business, right? Whereas, if we want a successful workforce, entrepreneurial skills are relevant whatever you do for a living. You might be a doctor, and if you're dealing with crises, you're dealing with your colleagues, you're dealing with things that are happening around you, that skill set of entrepreneurship will really help. The same in research science. It's really important.
Yeah, it's interesting, I suppose, the likes of the very successful vaccine program for COVID, which has rightly used our health service in a broad sense to do it successfully. If you look at the key people involved in that health service doing that, undertaking that program successfully, you could easily attach the keywords around entrepreneurship to that, I suppose.
So for example, you mentioned taking risks, and as somebody in business, I get why people would think that. But again, you'll have far more experience of this than I, as in your role in advisory. But if I would think I was pretty stupid if I just took risks. I think entrepreneurs in general take pretty calculated risks. So, if we're about to invest in a business or buy a company or sell a company, we take a lot of care and attention around what could go wrong, when, how, modeling. Got spreadsheets longer than the Dead Sea Scrolls, looking at all this stuff. In the same way that, skydiving ostensibly is quite a risky thing to do, but it really isn't when you look at the amount of risk management that goes into it. So I think this notion of just taking risks is a bit of a misnomer, because yes, it's a risk. When I go all in on an investment, and you put all your chips on it, of course it's a risk, but I'm doing it with reams of paper that will hopefully tell me what my real risks are. I think the danger is when you do see people going, oh, I'm going to make this clip that goes on the end of a cucumber to preserve it, which was one of the Dragon's Den ones. And people go, yeah, I mortgaged my house to do this. And you're like, no, that's a stupid risk. That's not proper entrepreneurship.
That's right. It's not balanced risk. We've had everyone, of course, as I mentioned earlier, is welcome to and please put some questions into the Q&A section, because it means Vikas doesn't just have to listen to my inane nonsense. So Andy Lovett's asked a good question on the topic of entrepreneurship, but on he's asking if you interviewed any social entrepreneurs and leaders apart from Jimmy Wales, which you did. Andy's describing that as those who founded a mission-driven business that reinvests its surplus to grow their impact on the community. So did you? The answer is yes, Andy, and Vikas will talk about that, about a few of those. But then specifically, is there now a moment for social business in the wake of the pandemic? Is there a change somehow?
So the short answer is yes, I did, and I'll elaborate on that, because of the short answer I think it'll be otherwise a bit dull. So social entrepreneurship is an interesting topic. So I spoke to people like Mohammed Yunus, who founded Grameen. I spoke to Jacqueline Novogratz, who is again a huge investor and social entrepreneur. And it's really interesting because social entrepreneurship used to be seen to be in the basket of trying to just crawl above the charity parapet, when it really isn't. It's businesses that effectively have a double bottom line, which is they quite rightly make money doing what they do, but they also have a social purpose. And you've got some businesses which were founded in that ilk, saying, well, we are here to solve a problem and we will do so successfully and make money in the process. And for the rest of the businesses of the world, they now have like ESG, like environmental and social governance, and CSR and B Corp certification to either genuinely make change or masquerade as making change. So social enterprise is also, I think in the UK, we sometimes get a bad, we don't necessarily get the best view of it, because in the UK in particular, most social entrepreneurs that you meet run micro enterprises. So they'll run a very local thing. Like it might be a local gardening service or a local white goods repair service or something. So in our mindset, we will think that's what social entrepreneurs are. Globally, it's very different. Globally, we look at things like microfinance institutions. We look at businesses that are providing internet connectivity. We're looking at healthcare businesses. Some of these social enterprises are in the tens of millions, hundreds of millions revenue category, because they're solving a genuine problem. Now, don't forget that the vast majority of humanity is not in the kind of global north, as it's now called. There's so many new phrases. We're not allowed to use the third world anymore. We're not allowed to use the developed world. It's now the global north. Or if you're talking to philosophers, they call it Occidental civilization. But in the global north, we still have quite a small, relatively, amount of the world's population. So the rest of that population, their challenges around healthcare, connectivity, energy, these are challenges which, if you solve them, you will make tons of money, right? And lift millions and millions of people out of poverty and give them a better standard of life. I am very much of the contention that the next generation of global billionaires are going to be social entrepreneurs. So if we fast forward a decade from now, I fully expect the Forbes rich list to have a lot more social entrepreneurs there who have founded and grown businesses specifically solving a global challenge. I really hope that's true, because it'll be good for the world. I'm also genuinely frightened that the reality is it'll just be lots of crypto people, and that I think would be a desperately sad outcome for the world. But I do genuinely hope that and see the case that social entrepreneurship will move up that list. And I think Andy is right that the pandemic has shown people the importance of social enterprise. It's shown people the importance of communities, of community capacity building, of businesses that are doing good. We're
Yeah,
moving
yeah.
away from that rational economic, the Homo economicus, as they call it, model of humanity to a realistic one.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I find it personally it fascinating the contrast between, you know, the big winners in the pandemic have included the likes of Amazon, obviously, which
Yeah.
is, you know, this massive multinational monster. I don't use that pejoratively, but monster business, as in monster, as in big, which is, you know, is obviously having an effect on community, as in high street retail, etc. And so there's that aspect which pushes on for good or bad. But at the same time, as you say, the social enterprise, the impact of the importance of community, and therefore an awareness of the likes of social enterprise,
Yeah.
has hopefully had its
So,
ante-upped as well.
so here's an interesting one. The International Financial Reporting Standards Board, a bit of a mouthful, and several large
You're
universities,
getting the accountants on the call very excited now.
and several other large international bodies are looking at creating new reporting standards for all businesses, which include social impact in a meaningful way. So let me give you an example. Let's say that you are making these cups, and let's say that you're making these cups in a dirty, filthy factory, and you're just ejecting your, detritus into the local river. That would be a cost, because that has a cost to society, which is measurable, like your carbon emissions. So in that model, your business may have made, let's say, £100 million profit, but you are now going to have to deduct the negative you do for the world, and your actual profit figure at the bottom of it is a socially adjusted profit figure, right?
Yeah.
Because this stuff's measurable now. So actually, if you are now, as the CEO of a large global manufacturing business, you have an incentive to do the right thing, because if you don't, you're going to get penalized for it in your bonus and your results. So realistically, you're going to have one basket of businesses who genuinely were set up to do the right thing to start with. But I think more importantly, we are going to have an adjustment of reporting standards for existing businesses that force them to do the right thing. So shipping is a great example of that. If you own a massive global fleet of big polluting container ships, your business will probably be loss making as a result of social financial reporting. So what's your incentive therefore is to invest in cleaner vessels for the future, right? So this is a genuinely important movement, and it's something which people need to start looking at. It's not just a small change to accounting regulation where you now can't capitalize sparkling water on your balance sheet. This is a massive wholesale change to how we think about what profit means, and I think it's a good thing.
Yeah, I would agree. It's a fascinating area of change, and I like the way we've managed to get leadership and entrepreneurship discussions onto accounting standards, Vikas. I'm very impressed by
listen,
that. Well done.
I know my audience.
So, Paul Dodgson just asked a follow-on the social entrepreneurship in the Q&A, just to finish that one off, perhaps, asking, does social entrepreneurship now extend to a sort of wider political arena? We've seen it recently with voting rights issues in the US, but where corporations, companies now consider the impact of the change, these changes that are being made on their employees or on their brand proposition, is his question. So it links with what you've just described, but it's a slightly different thing, isn't it? Are they actually considering impact on their people and their brand?
So it is interesting. So as a business, I believe you have the obligation to enable your employees to also be citizens and do the best as citizens. So I'll give a practical example from my own business life. When we had the referendum, inevitably with the, the number of people we've got in our workforce, there was going to be people who will remain and people who will leave. And it's not for me as a business to take a position, but it's for me as a business to encourage people to learn and to vote however they feel they want to vote, right? And I think it's things like that which businesses need to do. And it's hard because you might really disagree with the position, but it's not for you to decide what position someone should take. And I think actually, as businesses, giving people time to vote, giving people resources to learn, giving people the ability to be good citizens, to volunteer, to do these things, to become better people, better citizens, better community participants. I feel that that's an obligation that we have as business owners, because people make a choice to work for you. It's not that, they just suddenly fell through your door and there they are. They made an active choice. And even if the choice was there was no other job, they made a choice to work for you. And if they make that choice, you have a responsibility, not just for their health and safety and all that good stuff, but for them as human beings. And that encompasses citizenship. So you do see this. And I think more and more businesses, particularly in the US, are doing this, where like they gave people days off for voting. They give people banks of volunteer hours in the community. And that's much more effective than what European businesses do. So most European businesses are pretty bad at this. So what they'll say is, if any of our staff want to run a 10K, whatever you raise up to £500, we'll double it. Yay. Like that's the European business version of that, right? What I would love to see is more European businesses saying, look, on voting day, you go vote. It's really important. We want you to take the time, go and do it. You have a bank of volunteer hours, go volunteer, and then tell us what you did. These sorts of interventions are far more effective at building capacity in communities than the slightly tokenistic gestures that we tend to see in businesses this side of the Atlantic.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think one of the adjuncts to that is we're seeing it already, and I think we'll see it increasingly, will be employee involvement in ownership of the move, and it's not going to become the answer and wholesale in any sense at all, I don't think.
Yeah.
But employee ownership of businesses, or partial employee ownership of businesses, is a thing today and will increasingly be so, because it has many benefits.
Yeah. It's interesting as well, because employee ownership, I think, is a really good model. But there's also the kind of snake in the grass with employee ownership is the founder's rationale, right? There's a lot of founders who I've met who will do a lovely press release about how their business is now employee owned, but it was just an exit for them. It's not really an employee owned business. They just got a very, very tax efficient exit, right? Because their business wasn't saleable to anybody else. But I also know founders who made their money, they were comfortable, and they were like, well, actually, I've built this business and I want it to become a legacy. So they've taken the journey to become employee owned. They've really empowered their team, and they've taken a fair price. And that for me is the right approach. But unfortunately, I would say, in my very unscientific estimates, that is about maybe 20% of what happens. Most employee ownership press releases are basically just exits pretending to be good.
Yeah, there's certainly, I might disagree on the 20%, Vikas, but you're definitely right that there's an element which isn't actually about.
Maybe I'm too much of a cynic then.
If you're more of a cynic than me, you're a big cynic. Now we'll move on as time marches on to the final sort of broad topic I wanted to cover, which is failure. Mistakes and failure. And Jeremy Cole's asked a question in the Q&A which is on this topic and leads us into it nicely, which is, do you agree that a key skill of an entrepreneur is to be able to bounce back from multiple disappointments using their own motivation? And if so, how do you develop that skill? And you obviously using your the people you've interviewed and the examples they've given you, Vikas.
So I'm going to give a couple of parts of the answer to this, right? So when I was a bit younger, I used to do things like jiu-jitsu and just bits and pieces. I quite kind of enjoyed it, and I remember
that's why I never argue with you, Vikas.
I remember that one of the first things you learn is you go into the class when you're starting out, oh God, like what's it going to feel like to get hit in the face? Nothing prepares you. Nothing is going to prepare you. You can't read a book called Getting Hit in the Face and go, okay, cool, I know what it is. The minute someone hits you in the face with their foot, you're like, that really hurt. And you can either stay in a ball on the floor crying or you can get up, right? So failure is a bit like that. Like nothing. So there's certain skills you need, which I'll come to in a second, but nothing's going to prepare you for the feeling until it happens. It's horrid. My first business flamed out when the dot-com bubble burst. Nothing prepares you for that, right? But the things that you can prepare are resilience. So what that means is understand what anxiety feels like, understand stress management, understand healthy behaviors, understand things like mindfulness, how to calm yourself down, how to focus. That's what gets you through, right? In the same way that if you're going to get punched in the face, if you've got a strong back and a strong core and you're healthy, you're not going to break something, right? So in the same way, failure is a kind of psychological activity. So when I'm teaching on MBA programs, I always say to my MBA students that they need to start doing mentally positive activities early on in the MBA. So it might be mindfulness, it might be changing their eating and drinking habits, whatever it is, because that means that when the failure happens, which it inevitably will, you are just much more prepared and resilient to deal with it. But the reality is, nothing will prepare you for the actual act of that happening.
Yeah, I like the analogy, the brutal analogy of a kick in the face. There's a lot of truth. You touched there, Vikas. We'll wind up soon. I'll just check. No more open questions. We'll wind up soon, but you mentioned a few times, but you've just mentioned it again. Mindfulness, mental health. And you're quite open about mental health issues you've had in the past, as you should be. It's a great thing, and not enough of us are open about those sorts of things. But the impact in terms of being a leader, being an entrepreneur, and they're not the same thing, but in both those areas, the relevance of mental health and looking after it and so on. You're very keen and hot on that topic, rightly.
Yeah, it's something which I think any business founder is going to feel, the stress and the strain. And for some people it might just be on occasion, and I think particularly if your business is on a scaling journey, on a growth journey, or if going through challenges, it'll be constant, and that's when things become a problem. And the problem we have is that we tend to not talk about it. Sometimes because we feel embarrassed, and I think sometimes because we don't have the right forum or people to talk to, because a lot of business owners that I know who are on a scale journey, they'll build a wonderful non-executive board, and that board's very useful, but that board is not the board you go to when you're sat there going, I can't carry on, I'm really failing, because they've got a governance duty as well. And if you say that to them, chances are you're going to be reviewed, right? Because that's their job, right? That's where mentors are really useful, because your mentor, even, some of the most successful business people I know still have a mentor or a peer or someone that's trusted like that, where they can go, I just don't think I can do this anymore. And maybe that's true. And maybe their mentor can help them then think about what next, or maybe it's a particular situation. Now, I'm not just saying this because you're on the call, but I think, you as an advisor are that for a lot of people, because, I think if you find when people ask me, what firm should I choose? I'm like, it doesn't matter, because it's the relationship, right? And you need to find someone who you can build that level of trust with, where they could pick up the phone to you, Stephen, and go, Stephen, we're in a real mess. What do I do? Right? Because if you've not got someone around you that you can have that conversation with, you are literally not going to be able to move forward when things go bad. And as so many businesses have seen in this pandemic, that happens. It is basically a normal part of the business journey. I am weirdly more worried when I meet entrepreneurs who don't seem to get stressed because it basically means they're psychopaths.
Yeah, there's a number of those around, that's for sure. Yeah, it's interesting. We've got many examples in our business at K Johnson G of clients who have had hard times,
Mm-hmm.
and those difficult times are at least as important as the good times, and they're great examples, because you should learn from them, both the people involved, but also others should learn. The problem is that even if you anonymize those stories, it it isn't. It's somehow not as. It's just not as positive and not as business business focused to
But
talk about the failures and the negatives.
we
But we should, because the learning is huge, isn't it?
we attribute success so often to genius when it's actually just a tailwind, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So most of the largest technology businesses in the world, so Amazon, I think, is the exception. But if we look at businesses like Google and Facebook and Uber, they had a tailwind. The timing was perfect. They weren't the first, they weren't the best, but their timing was perfect. They had a tailwind. When businesses go through difficulty, that's when the genius bit comes out. That's when you figure out who has or has not got the skills, right? And you saw businesses like Apple who went through a couple of immensely rough periods, like Microsoft did, and they bounce back and they keep going. And that to me is a symbol of skill, right? Like that the people who are able to get through turbulence and keep flying, that to me is what we should be looking at, because most of the big success stories that we see, unfortunately, had that element of luck and tailwinds that contributed to the big success story in retrospect.
Yeah, exactly. Very good. Well, it's just turned 10 o'clock, Vickers, and we said we'd limit it to an hour or so. So we'll wind up. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to
Thank you for having me.
join us and talk about some of the findings and thoughts from your book.
Mm-hmm.
We'll give a link to the book for anyone that doesn't have
Thank
it
you.
already, if they're interested in buying it, which they should. It's a fascinating book, and it isn't just a business book, as I mentioned at the beginning. The other topics are huge. A topic like democracy. It's good chunky stuff. So thank you, Vickers, very very much indeed.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks to everyone for joining us, because without you on the call, it would just have been me and Vickers having a little chat, which is interesting for me, but maybe not as relevant. The next K Johnson G seminar is May the 11th, and that will be on the topic of importing and exporting, or trade more generally. Obviously, post, or is it still during Brexit? I'm never quite sure. But anyway, trade position in today's environment, which will be interesting. May the 11th, we'll circulate details. So thanks again, everyone. This has been K Johnson G with Vikas Shah this morning, and we have hopefully been helping you build a better business. Take care, everyone.